Support for this episode comes from the University of San Francisco's SWIG program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice, better known as JSSJ. The new JSSJ graduate level certificate program in JEDI, Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, equips professionals with invaluable skills, tools, and resources that organizations need to bridge generational gaps and ensure inclusive growth. Learn from renowned experts like Julia Watts-Belzer in her upcoming course, Disability and Jewish Social Justice. Apply for her class by May 15th. Go to usfca.edu/JEDI. That's usfca.edu/JEDI.
This is Judaism Unbound, episode 429, The Jewish Calendar. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And today we're taking a break from our series of episodes looking at Judaism and disability to explore another topic near and dear to our hearts, which is the Jewish calendar, Jewish holidays. Our guest today is Dalia Marx, who is the author of a new book about the Jewish year, the Jewish holidays. It's called From Time to Time, Journeys in the Jewish Calendar. Before we get into this interview, we just want to announce that our second round of short on yeshiva classes is now available for you to register for. You can head over to judaismunbound.com/classes to learn more about these classes. They include classes on Jewish zines, on the Jewish approach to birthing and dying, and on the Torah of wholeness and becoming. Head over to judaismunbound.com/classes to learn more and register. So, as you know, we are always really interested on Judaism Unbound in talking about the holidays, the Jewish holidays in new ways. It's not just the Jewish holidays. We're interested in talking about all elements of Jewish practice in new ways. The holidays are a particularly important one because there are so many of them, because there's always another chance to experiment with something coming around the corner. I mean, life cycle rituals don't come around that often, but the holidays are always coming around. And so it's a really good laboratory for us to play around with some of the ideas that we're talking about. And every once in a while, there's a new book that comes out on the Jewish holidays that takes a different approach to it and that brings new insights, new understandings, new materials that are valuable as we think about Judaism in new ways. And this book, From Time to Time, Journeys in the Jewish Calendar, is one of them. And our guest today, Dalia Marx, who is the author of this book, is a Reform rabbi from Israel. Some people don't realize that there are Reform rabbis in Israel. There are. She is the Rabbi Aaron D. Penkin Professor of Liturgy and Midrash at Hebrew Union College in Jerusalem. Dalia Marx is the lead editor of the Israeli Reform Sidur called Tfilat HaAdam. Dalia Marx has a doctorate from the Hebrew University and rabbinic ordination from Hebrew Union College. We are thrilled to get into this conversation about the Jewish holidays, about Jewish time. So, Dalia Marx, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you.
Good to be with you.
So I want to say that the first time I was introduced to your book was from our dear friend Tova Birnbaum, who had been working at the time at the Oshman Family JCC in Palo Alto. And she said this was just, a wonderful book. And other people have told me that over the years. Like a lot of our favorite guests have loved your book. And I want to know from you, when you set out to write this book, what was the problem that you were addressing? Like, why do we need another book on the Jewish holidays? Like, what was your take more generally that inspired you to say we need to have a new book on the Jewish year?
I think, first of all, yes, of course, there are many books on the Jewish year, but I think time is an essential aspect of human lives. That's how we understand, perceive our existence, our lives. And I think it's even more meaningful and more important for Jews. Just to bring Abram Joshua Heschel's remark on time, he says that Jews build cathedrals in time. Shabbat is our cathedral in time. Jews could not always depend on space. So time was really the things that kept us together, even though we were and we are dispersed in the four corners of the world. Throughout the ages, Jews were debating about time. There are different opinions about when exactly do we need to celebrate Shavuot, right? In Second Temple time, this was a great debate between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the two main groups of Jews at that time. But I think the interesting thing, and I would say even miraculous thing in my eyes, that today we cannot agree on almost anything. And I live in Jerusalem in a neighborhood that is really all types of people from the Israeli society are here, and we don't agree on anything. And we have really one thing we don't disagree on, and that's time. And so it doesn't matter how you celebrate your Shabbat, but we all agree that we're recording this on Thursday, that in 2 days it's going to be Shabbat. So I don't know if you spend it in the synagogue or with the family, or even shopping at the mall, or going to play soccer, or going to, hike in nature. It is a special and marked time. We have the marking of time as something that is very shared by everyone. And I found it really comforting. And it's even redemptive to know that we can agree on things, even though there are so many things that divide.
Well, there's so many ideas that you're talking about that I'm excited to pursue that are more in the theoretical range where I tend to float up into. But I was thinking that maybe we could start by grounding ourselves in a bit of an example, because we have the holiday of Shavuot coming up soon after this episode is going to be released, but not so soon. So people will have some time to think about Shavuot based on this conversation. And I'm wondering if we could just sort of start by getting your take on Shavuot in terms of the way that you talk about it in this book. Shavuot is a holiday that, at least in America, a lot of people have never heard of, and yet there are a growing number of people who seem to be interested in it. So I'm wondering if we could just talk a little bit about Shavuot, and for our time, what you think its potential power is. Why should we be celebrating it? What might it look like to celebrate it in a way that people would experience as powerful and want to remember to celebrate it next year, even though they're going to have to remember on their own because the school year won't remind them?
Right. It's also my favorite festival. My birthday is around it. And I like, one of the things that I like about it is that it doesn't mark, nobody tried to kill us. We were not saved there's just a very peaceful type of Chag. But I think you're right. Shavuot, in a way, is an orphan Chag. One of the reasons is that Shavuot in our days, that is to say, after the destruction of the temple almost 2,000 years ago, does not have distinct mitzvah or distinct religious commandment that is attached to it. Unlike Passover, in Passover we have two very significant mitzvot. One is tell it unto your children, vehigalet lebincha, and the second one is eating unleavened bread, matzot. And the same with Sukkot, the Tabernacle Festival. We have the commandment to dwell in the sukkah, in the tabernacle for 7 days, and we have the 4 species. So it's something that is very present. What is the special thing about Shavuot? Not a lot. And this is, I think, the cool thing about Shavuot. You never have cultural vacuum. Cultural vacuums tend to fill in. So when there is no religious commandment that is specifically related to Shavuot, you have all kinds of minhagim and customs that are related to it. One of them is to eat dairy food. There are different explanations for this minhag, for this custom. Maybe because the Torah is like milk and honey. It's so sweet to us. We don't want to eat, animals. And I'm vegetarian. So it, of course, since I was 6 years old, by the way. So it's a festival that is touching my heart that, we don't kill anybody on this festival. It's a peaceful Chag. Although the real reason probably was that in Ashkenaz, in Germany, in Central North Europe, most of the animals already gave birth and there was a lot of milk. So what do you do with all this milk? Well, you make cheesecakes and whatever you need to do on Shavuot. Unlike any other festival, Torah does not give us a designated date for it. The only thing that we hear is that we have to count 7 weeks after, and that's the question, after what, right? Because the Hebrew says mimochorat Shabbat, the day after what? Maybe the day after Shabbat, Saturday, the 7th day. That is to say, we have to start counting these 7 days on Sunday after the festival of Passover. That's how the Sadducees understood it. The Pharisees understood it in a different way. And of course, today we are all descendants of the Pharisees. Doesn't matter if you're Orthodox or conservative or Reform, secular, atheist, we are all descendants of the Pharisees. The Pharisees understood Mimochorat Shabbat as the day after the festival. Shabbat is the day of rest. That is to say, that's Pesach, a day of after Pesach. And this is where we start to count 7 weeks that will lead us to Shavuot, to the festival of Shavuot. And this counting of 7 weeks is what we call the counting of the Omer. And now that we have a fixed calendar, we know when Shavuot is going to fall. We know when it's going to be in 10 years or 20 years from now. That's not a problem. But back in the day when you had to calculate every month anew and every year you had to calculate when it begins, you could not trust when Shavuot will fall. So you had to be very attentive to the calendar and to the authority of the Beit Din, of the court who determined when the month begins. And that's the only way you could know when Shavuot will eventually fall.
There's a lot to unpack here, and I'm very excited to do it. So some of our listeners may have a sense of where I'm going, because I've mentioned in the past, my own set of influences Jewishly includes Karaite Jews, who are the descendants of the Sadducees folks that you described. So a part of me, when you said, all of us are descendants of the Pharisees, a part of me is definitely feeling called to say, well, like, yes, that is basically how history is played out generally, but there are people, including in Israel, there are Karaites, and there are others of us who we might still be followers of that rabbinic tradition in many senses, but we actually feel called to other kinds of Jewish ways of living that might not be centered now. So I want to bring that in, but not just for like no reason, not just to be a contrarian, but because this points to some deep things. So you talked about how Shavuot in the Torah has no defined date. It now on the rabbinic calendar is always the 6th of Sivan, because if you always count the Omer, if you always count those 7 weeks from the second night of Passover, you will always end up having 7 weeks later be the 6th of Sivan. I bring that up because the debates you're describing, they are not small debates about the calendar. Like, as you said, like calendars are meant to be like the structural foundation of how you live. You can always debate exactly how to do holidays, but like when they are, if you're not even celebrating them on the same day, it's very hard to operate with one another. And that's why historically, as Karaites have become more and more of a tiny group, fun fact, about 1,000 years ago, they may have been as many as a third or 40% of the world's Jews. So it's not like they were nothing. But like as they've become a smaller and smaller group, the hardest thing to preserve has been the calendar. They're still able to keep kosher the way that they understand kashrut. They're still able to do a lot. But like when you don't have critical mass of people celebrating your days on your days, that's a really tough thing.
And therefore, the question, who determines the time? Who determines when the festival falls? That's very, very meaningful. Today, we don't really have these debates, only when you have new festivals or new marked days, memorial days. So there was a great debate, for example, when do we remember the Holocaust? Different segments of the Jewish population have different days.
So I mentioned my Karaite connection, but look, I'm not here to argue we need to adopt the Karaite calendar. What I am here to argue is that the arguments are very fruitful. Like, I actually wish the whole Jewish population, not only for the new days, but for the older days, was having these conversations, because I think it unpacks something deep about our relationship to the holidays. So, for example, I have for years counted the Omer with the Karaites. I mark Passover by the rabbinic calendar, but then I count the 7 weeks starting the Sunday within Passover. So starting the day after Shabbat and not the day after the first Seder. Every once in a while, that's the same, because sometimes the Passover Seder on the rabbinic calendar is on a Shabbat, and so the second night coincides. Most years, they're different. But what's interesting is if we lived in my fantasy land, Shavuot would always be a Sunday. Shavuot being on a weekend, I actually think would be a boon for the observance of Shavuot. Like if Shavuot were always on a weekend, which in my view is what the Torah kind of prescribes, that would serve my goals of a Jewish world where people celebrate Shavuot, because it would be on a weekend, which would be more convenient. We've learned from the past that when we do it on a weeknight, we do a 24-hour Zoom event, way fewer people come. And the people who do come for less time, which makes sense because it's a work day and people in the U.S. aren't getting off of work for Shavuot usually. I mean, they might get off for Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. They're probably not for something like Shavuot. Our goal is to have a beautiful observance on a day when people can actually share it. And for our audience, turns out the weekend is more doable. And I also can say to them, if they're looking for sort of authenticity, I can say there's actually a precedent Jewishly for Shavuot always being on a weekend. That's an interpretation of a very large group of Jews. So I wanted to throw that out there just because I'm curious, like, how you would navigate those questions of like the ways in which holidays have united us and unified us, but also the losses we have because we've simplified them. We've lost some of the juicy backstories and debates that you actually go into deeply in your book.
Right, and I think you're absolutely right. By the way, about Karaites, two main groups in contemporary Judaism that were accused, as it were, of being Karaites. One of them is the Reform movement. I'm a Reform rabbi that put a lot of stress on the Bible, especially the prophets, and not so much stress on rabbinic literature. And the second one, and I found it interesting, is the kibbutz movement. If you look in kibbutz, the kibbutz movement observance of Chagim, of festivals such as Passover or such as the Omer, it's very connected to the biblical text and not so much rabbinic literature. So both groups were sort of accused, as it were, as being Karaites. I like the diversity in our festivals and our time very much. And I think this is what I try to celebrate in this book, because this book is really all about opening gates, encouraging people to learn and to experience. It doesn't mean that anything and everything goes. I did not include racist remarks or sexist ideas or chauvinist or nationalistic ideas, but I really deliberately try to bring as many voices as possible. So I think, Lex, this is to answer your question. I try to bring a Ashkenazic tradition, that is to say Western traditions, but also Eastern traditions, Sephardic and Mizrahi traditions. I myself am a combination of both. And also what was really important for me is to bring female voices. Yeah, that this is something that is a soaring place in our tradition. I would say, essentially all our classical books were composed, redacted, printed, learned, distributed by men. It doesn't mean that women did not have their celebrations and rituals and ceremonies and prayers and supplications, but they were not preserved because they were transmitted orally from grandmother to granddaughter, from mother to daughter. And with the perils of persecutions and Holocaust and immigrations and the melting pot idea, at least in the state of Israel, a lot of it was lost to us. So I think this is one of the challenges of our generation, to bring traditions that are not just composed or created by men. To your point about the diversity, I think one thing that really I found very important and essential is to bring communal festivals and observances. So we have the Mimuna after Passover, and we have the Saharane, and that's the festival of the Kurdish community, and we have the Sigd, which is the Ethiopian festival. I didn't know of the Sigd until this great
It's my birthday. My Hebrew birthday is the 29th of Cheshvan.
Oh my God.
Fun fact.
So you're a Sigd boy.
Yes.
This is cool. So I think this is something that is very interesting to add ethnic aspects of our festivals. And this also brings question. What does the Mimuna mean for me? I had a call from the head of the Sephardic organization here, and he said, this is the first time the Mimuna is included in a book about the year cycle. He was very happy about it.
And Mimuna being an end of Passover festival that is often marked in like ways across cultures, across ethnicities, but especially sort of native to North Africa.
That is true. My Sephardic grandfathers used to tell me that he lived in Jerusalem. He used to say that the Muslim women used to carry cakes and loaves of bread and all kinds of baked good to the houses of the Jews after the end of Passover, because they could not make bread during Passover. And so they used to begin eating bread together. But for them, it wasn't like a celebration. It didn't have its own rituals. And it was very important for me to bring the Mimuna, because in Israel, it has become a very political celebration. You see all the politicians meet, they film themselves in television they make sure they are filmed on television or seen on the media eating the special baked good that it's called mufleta, with dripping of honey. And I found it really disturbing because this is a festival that has a lot of really profound values about intercultural and interfaith relationship between the Jews and the Muslims. So it was important for me to bring this to people's attention.
You're talking about bringing new Jewish holidays to people's attention, and you're talking about bringing new traditions, not that they're new traditions, but they're new to people. Like if they came from the West, then the Eastern ones are new to them and vice versa. And you're bringing all this more and more and more and more. I've taught a class on the Jewish holidays, and I also teach an Introduction to Judaism class, and we look at the holidays, and I've been showing them as a circle the way that you have in your book. And, but then I show them through the different periods, and I say, look, in the biblical period, we basically had 3 major holidays, Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot, and 3 pretty much minor holidays, Rosh Hashanah, or Yom Teruah, and Yom HaKippurim, and Shmini Atzeret. That was kind of it. And then you say, and let's look at what happened. In the Second Temple, they added Hanukkah and Purim, and then the rabbis came along and they added a bunch more, and they elevated the minor holidays into major holidays. And you can and then Israel came along and added a bunch more. And then you have these other holidays that maybe you didn't know about, like Sigd, And what you start to see happening on this circle is it's getting crowded and more crowded. And, I've become a religious convert to the school of Marie Kondo, which is about tidying up your house, right? It's a famous book. This has gotten very cluttered. So I'm wondering how you advise people to think about the potential of the overwhelm of the amount of holidays and the amount of possibilities to do on the holidays. And I think some people tend to embrace that and try to do all of it, and somehow that works for them. Some people say, it's too overwhelming. I can't do all of it. So I guess I would be a bad Jew if I didn't do all of it. So I'll do none of it. Right. And other people find other ways. But the reason I'm asking this question is that you're saying something about the power of time and the power of the calendar that I worry that people are missing, whether they do all of it or none of it. And I'm wondering if you can help people sort of navigate to a golden mean that would say, this is a way that you could actually experience the Jewish calendar and the Jewish holidays in a way that was powerful, but not overwhelming.
Absolutely. I think we need to prioritize. I was the lead editor of the Israeli Reform Siddur that is called Tfilat Adam, the prayer of the human being. By the way, it's important, the prayer of the human being, because Adam in Hebrew means human being. It doesn't mean what it means in English. We wanted to bring special Shabbatot, special Shabbat, and we ended up with 50-something. And people said, we cannot include everything because then nobody will do any of them if it's too crowded, as you say. And we ended up picking a few. One of them is, and each one of them has its own importance. So we have Pride Shabbat, liturgy for Pride Shabbat, for example, Shabbat that marks the struggle against domestic violence, something like this, but not all the Shabbatot that we could think of. I think we need to be informed about all the range of what we have, but then eventually you end up deciding what you do and how you do it. I would like to think that everything is mine, including things that are terrible. I choose not to celebrate them, but it doesn't mean that they're not mine. With regard to ethnic celebrations, we spoke about the Sigd and the Mimuna and the Saharane, but what about Thanksgiving? I know that it is a very important celebration for my American friends. Can it be considered a Jewish festival or Jewish marked day? Definitely the value is Jewish. We endorse Thanksgiving, but the date is not Jewish. And even more soaring is the Novi God, which is the New Year Day celebrated by Jews of the former Soviet Union. They have all this symbolism for this day that I know of families who used to celebrate it with the curtains closed, and like secretly, like the Moranos in Spain, they were very afraid to celebrate it openly. And now their children they want to be proud about it. This is our tradition. We are very Jewish and we are Israelis, but we are Israelis and Jewish of a certain kind. So we want to celebrate Novi God, and they invite a lot of people to celebrate with them. And I think it's a very beautiful thing because I don't want people to hide behind their closed curtains because they're embarrassed of what the neighbors will say. But again, is it a Jewish festival? I don't know, maybe, because Jewish people celebrate it.
Yeah. I want to dwell in whether we have too many holidays or I think Dan and I we share a diagnosis. I agree with the diagnosis that we have like thrown on top of, like, we've taken like ice cream that is the Jewish year and we've thrown like every topping on it, which is to say like a million holidays, and it's like it's not coherent. We haven't been thinking at every stage of adding holidays like, oh, we have this existing flow of the year and we're going to throw in Purim and Hanukkah now if we're a while ago. How do we do that in a way that keeps the whole thing cohesive? Oh, now we're adding in the 9th of Av and like Memorial Fast Days. We're going to think about how that flows in and not disrupt the overall thematic flow. Oh, now we're adding in Holocaust remembrance. We're adding in I don't think there's been this big picture thinking. The analogy I'm being called to is like a musical piece. I feel like the Bible had kind of a symphony or like it had one coherent thing. I would argue there's actually like one holiday in the Bible. Like it's obviously not. Like there's different days. There's Passover, there's Shavuot, there's Sukkot, there's Shmini Atzeret. But like when they are brought up, they tend to be brought up together. The Torah gives you like the flow of the year. And it's clear that there's a relationship between Passover and Shavuot. Right. That's why you count, whether it's after Shabbat or after the first day of Passover, you count between them to get from one to the next. It's clear that there's a relationship between Shavuot and Sukkot and Passover. These three, we tend to call them festivals or pilgrimage festivals. They're three footfalls, the regalim. They're three moments you walk in the Bible. And all of the holidays actually take place basically in one half of the year, from the 14th of Nisan through the, I guess, 22nd of the 7th, from the 14th of the first month to the 22nd of the 7th month. You put everything in half the year, and then you have half the year to chill a little bit because of what Dan says. Like, there's already an overwhelm even in the Bible that you need to take a break from. So but where I differ with Dan is I kind of like, I like the idea that we would throw in our own holidays and come up with our own things. But what I want us to do is not be random about it, is not just throw it in. And that's what we've done, I think, at every stage. It's just been like, oh, tree holiday, throw that here. Right. Oh, remember the destruction of the temple day. That'll be in the summer because we sort of have some shout outs in the Bible. Oh, Holocaust Day. I mean, you mentioned there were deliberations about this, but I think they were less about creating a functional full year than they were about like, what is the correct day to think about the Holocaust and why? And that's episodic. That's making a series of episodes. If we're talking like TV, it's not creating like a film that is one coherent whole. And so I want to pivot to the flow of the year actually separate from just the holidays. Similar to how I'm influenced by Karaites, I'm influenced by the Book of Jubilees, which is one of many Jewish texts that features 4 seasonal days. So the first of the first month, the first of the fourth month, the first of the 7th month, the first of the 10th month. Those are key markers in Jubilees. They're also key markers in the Talmud that don't quite become holidays, quote unquote. They call us to an orientation where we relate to the fullness of the year. We turn the page on seasons. We think about solstices and equinoxes. That seems to be part of why these days are important. And so I'd love to ask, like, how do we think about this a little more cohesively? It's a version of Dan's question, but I'm actually okay with the conclusion that we're going to have a gazillion holidays as long as we orient them not like 6 separate movements or 6 separate tracks on a CD, but rather as a coherent album.
This is so cool. You are really, Alex, you are really a Karaite, because you talk about the year cycle according to Jubilees. Of course, Jubilees did not know Karaites, but it's based on exclusively on the solar system, where you have a very clear year. And you have a calendar of 364 days. I don't know what about the one extra day, but that's a different story. And you have 4 quarters of the year, and each one begins in a cardinal point of the equinox, of the solstice. And each one has 91 days. And the month, it's very, very orderly. That's not how the rabbis went on about it. When you talk about the year cycle, according to the rabbinic literature, it's a messy thing. It's a very messy thing. And you have to decide on each month before it begins. And you cannot predict. So it's a collaboration in a way between heaven and earth, between the seasons and between what people do. It's a luni-solar system, right? It's based basically on the lunar system, but you have corrections according to the solar system. That's why this year we have a leap year, or as we say in Hebrew, pregnant year, Shana Meuberet. We have 13 months instead of 12 to sort of bring the lunar system closer to the solar system, because otherwise the year that is only based on the moon, the lunar year, is much shorter. It's 354 point something days. That's how the Muslims work. And that's why the Muslim holy month Ramadan moves from around the year. Sometimes it's in the winter, and then my Muslim friends are very happy because the fast is very short. But sometimes it's fall on the summer, and then it's really tough. So the Jewish calendar is sort of collaborating this. But nevertheless, what you say, I think, is absolutely true. It's a very messy system. The connections between the festivals are sometimes loose, and you have different layers that don't necessarily take into consideration the previous layers. The difference between you and me is that I like it. I like it to be messy. I like this nature of something that is a little bit unruly and untidy. Yeah, and I think now you have to distinguish between what was initially decided to be part of a system, like what you said about the 3 pilgrimage festivals, and what was later retroactively became part of a system. So I think the Israeli high holidays, as we sometimes refer to them, they present a system. Yeah. So after Passover, which is the celebration of redemption and deliverance from Egypt, you have the Memorial Day of the Holocaust. And a week later, you have the Memorial Day for the fallen soldiers, right? So from the Holocaust, you move to the perils of the establishment of the State of Israel. And the next day, this is a bit, to some people, some people believe that it's a bit cruel. Right when the Memorial Day for the fallen soldiers end, the Day of Independence begin. It's a very somber and serious day. And then all of a sudden you have the fireworks and people go out and dance in the street. And then at the end of that month, you have the Yom Yerushalayim, the Jerusalem Day, which is, I would say, one of the most controversial days in the calendar, because what do you really celebrate in Yom Yerushalayim? Do you celebrate the unification of Jerusalem, the east and west part of Jerusalem? Do you mark the occupation of East Jerusalem? What do you do on that day? Do you go to the Muslim neighborhoods and dance and sing offensive songs against them? Or is it a day of a reconciliation and conversation and interacting between different parts of Jerusalem? So the day is marked in the calendar, but how you celebrate it is different. But here you do have a system of 4 days that are created in a way that it's gradual from past to future. To me, Jerusalem marks the future, the hope that it will be shalem, right? Yerushalayim, that we'll have a shalem, we'll have wholeness, we'll have something that is complete. And also the word shalom comes from that same root. So this is a day that I look toward the future with hope.
I want to pick up on that question about essentially the function of the calendar, because the way that you described it in terms of like you said, the Israeli high holidays, those were kind of constructed in our time, in recent memory. And we know how they were constructed, and they were constructed to produce a certain emotional result, right? I mean, the reason why Memorial Day is the day before Independence Day is to try to provoke a certain emotional experience on people. And, by the way, when we look at the Mishnah talking about the Passover Seder and how it's supposed to be, or by the way, parentheses, I don't really believe it's describing a Seder, but anyway, we can imagine that it's talking about a Seder, and it says, right, that you're supposed to go from the depths of despair to exaltation at the end, right? They're giving you a certain emotional experience that you're supposed to produce at your Seder. I'm not sure that most of us are very good at producing that, but we know that was kind of at least what the Mishnah was thinking about. And so for me, the question is, I've heard Yitz Greenberg, for example, talk about a theory of the holidays, that they're meant to almost rev up your engines on a certain topic to try to get you through the rest of the year until that holiday comes back around, where you start to, whatever that revved up, like maybe you would say Passover revs up our engines about justice or about liberation. And that tends to, slow down and peter out by the end of a year. So then the Passover comes again and we can rev ourselves up again and be the people we want to be in the year. That kind of theory feels exciting to me because it's a theory. It's not a mess, right? It's not just kind of a grab bag of things that we could do Jewishly. There's a sense that, no, the function of Judaism is to try to help us be a certain kind of person. My question for you, I guess, is whether you think that that's the function, or should be the function, or was once the function and shouldn't be anymore, or what was there a theory? Is there a theory behind the Jewish year? Or is it more that it's become, and it's good that it's become, just kind of the cultural practices of our people, and that's what it is, and people can do different kinds of things. And like you said at the beginning, the really important thing is that we all do it at the same time, because it's that time element that keeps us together. I'm thinking, just for me, it's like, well, if Passover, for example, is meant to rev up our engines about like justice and loving the stranger, then I would say it's not really working well enough. Maybe having it once a year isn't enough. And then I would say, oh, well, maybe let's reimagine Sukkot now, 6 months later, as also about justice and liberation, right? And so we only have to make it through 6 months of the year with each holiday, something like that. But again, I'm not sure that my approach is the best approach or even a coherent approach, and I'm curious what you think.
I think there's a great and profound wisdom about our festivals and holidays and marked days, and about how the year is constructed in general. But again, I think it's very messy. I think there's a lot of redundancies. So Passover, as you say, is about social justice. But what about, we celebrate on Hanukkah human rights. And also Sukkot is when you go outside and you celebrate the 70 nations of the world. So I think there's a great variety and redundancy in each one of our Chagim, and that's the beauty of it. I don't think there's one size fit all for each one of the Chagim. On the contrary, each one of the Chagim, each one of the festivals allow us to experience all kinds of things. So one year you can think about Passover as a celebration of deliverance and freedom. And another year you can talk about the spring. Another year you can talk about intergenerational conversation or journeys, or all kinds of things. And everything is embedded in the tradition. Also, what you said before about the days that are thrown all around. For example, the 4 fast days that have to do with the destruction of the temple. 2 of them are in the summer. We have the 17th of Tammuz, and then we have the 9th of Av. And you can say it's really in the middle of nowhere, and the educational system in Israel also doesn't work. So what do we do with them? But in fact, it reflects probably an old Mesopotamian mood when nature seemed like it's dying, right? So Tammuz, we know Tammuz, the name of the month Tammuz is also a name of a Mesopotamian Babylonian god Tumuzi or Dumuzi, who died every year and it was in the realm of death for 6 months, and then he came back to life. And in a way, this is also something that we celebrate at that time. So the 17th of Tammuz mark the breaching of the walls of Jerusalem, and then 3 weeks later we we mark the destruction of the temple on the 9th of Av. And that's in the dead of the summer. And right from that moment, we begin 7 weeks of consolation. So you see that there is conversations between different parts of the Jewish year, but I wouldn't say that there's one system that is that underlines the entire story or that informs how it works. That would be too simple, I think. As I said, we are messy people.
Yeah, and I like some of the mess too. I don't mean to suggest that like we need a perfect 4/4 time signature, since I was using like music. Like we don't need like a really drilled out, like perfectly symmetrical year. I do just want us to at least, maybe it's retroactive. Maybe it's we have these scattering of holidays that were not made super intentionally. We are going to do the thing that Dan described. We're going to generate a theory. We're going to generate an undergirding set of principles. Like you mentioned the fast days. I think, I can speak to an American context on this. Like, the story of the 9th of Av in American Judaism, you cannot tell without talking about summer camps. It is very clear that the observance of the 9th of Av in the summer has shot through the roof in non-Orthodox communities because it takes place during the summer, and it's the only holiday or whatever we call it, observance that happens in the summer. So it's a chance for Jewish summer camps that want to do some kind of observance that is like part of the calendar, they can really dive into that one. They can't do Passover unless they're going to move it to their time of year. I've actually considered like what would it be like if summer camps just sort of did the rest of the year. I think it'd be kind of cool, but they haven't. So that's like a practical reason, and it fills a gap in that flow of time. So maybe we say that's a feature, not a bug. I don't think that's why the 9th of Av was placed where it was, but I think we could sort of retroactively generate something. And that relates to the question I have, which is, we're talking about holidays, even with Passover, like Festival of Liberation. I think that's true for like what it is. And I think Passover, more than many of our other holidays, although not all of them, it's been mission driven. Like it's actually stayed on brand for a few thousand years. Its core message of leaving Egypt and like from slavery to freedom, I think Passover has kept that pretty steady for a few thousand years. Shavuot, which we started with, totally not mission driven. Shavuot started as this agriculturally driven holiday. There's nothing in the Bible itself about Shavuot being a holiday of revelation, of receiving teaching. Nothing there. I'm not saying that it's false to say that Shavuot is about revelation. I think what then happens is people tack on a new meaning. And what's interesting is the Book of Jubilees is a key part of that story, because over and over again, Jubilees brings up Shavuot, which in Hebrew is a word that means both week, like 7-day period, and also means like oath or oaths. And it anchors Shavuot to all of these oaths, all of these covenants between God and humans and between humans and humans. And it seems that Jubilees and other Jewish communities make Shavuot about receiving Torah because it's this big sort of covenantal revelation moment. And that's great. And then over time, it becomes in the 1500s, like stay up all night and learn Torah with your friends because like coffee's invented and all of a sudden it's easier to stay up all night. Like that's, we had somebody talk about the history of coffee, and it turns out that a large reason why staying up all night becomes a Shavuot ritual is because coffee's around to make that a sustainable practice. And so we reinvent holidays, and I actually, I think that's appropriate. I think Passover is one end of the spectrum where we kind of stay solid as a rock and a holiday maintains its character. But another is a Shavuot where, honestly, if you told me in 1,000 years, I mean, God willing, humanity will still exist and climate change won't have wiped us all out. But if you told me in 1,000 years, Shavuot has nothing to do with Torah revelation, it has nothing to do with the barley and wheat stuff that the Torah is interested in, it has some entirely new meaning that I can't even imagine, I would respond like, yeah, that's probably right. That makes sense based on the trajectory of Shavuot so far. So I'm kind of curious to hear about ways in which we can celebrate the transformations of holidays and not just sort of notice their through lines that have stayed consistent.
Right. I want to challenge a little bit what you said about Pesach, about Passover, because I think it has changed throughout the generations. If you went to a kibbutz Passover celebration, you would see God is not invited in many kibbutzim. God is not mentioned in the Passover Haggadah. But on the other hand, you have a great celebration of springtime. It's a seasonal thing and a great connection to the land and to the agriculture world. So Passover itself is changing. So I think Passover has a solid character, but it's also is subject to change. And when you talk about Shavuot, the counting of 7 weeks, by the way, this is something that we often see. You mentioned the Book of Jubilees. You also have other 7 weeks counting to other festivals, the festival of the grapevine.
And Sigd, which you mentioned before, that's another 7 weeks from Yom Kippur.
Right. And then you mentioned the new innovations that the rabbis brought, that this is a day, on this day the Torah was given. Once again, they also felt that this is somewhat an orphan chag and we need extra content to it. There are some scholars, for example, Israel Yuval, that believes that we took it from the Christians, right? Because the Christians celebrate Pentecost around that time. This is when the Holy Spirit descended according to their faith. And we had something else descending. It's not the Holy Spirit, it's the Torah. So we kind of had to reclaim the descendants of something. And we have the giving of the Torah, the Matan Torah in Shavuot. And then it became a celebration that also referred to personal giving of the Torah, because young Jewish children, and when I say children, I mean boys, began their educational life on Shavuot. And there are beautiful description of it. I have a chapter on it in my book. And later generations, we have the confirmation celebrations also typically on Shavuot. So you see how concepts in Judaism are shaped and reshaped throughout the generation. And I think Shavuot is a very good example for that. I wanted to say something else about the 9th of Av. I was in a summer camp in Olingsen Ruby Union Institute in Oconomowoc.
Wisconsin. I'm from Wisconsin.
All right. So we also had that. We had to build a temple, and then we destroyed it, and all the children were crying because we worked on it for so long. So I know what you're talking about. But this is an interesting thing also by the rabbis. They say, what are we going to celebrate when we are in times of joy and peace? Do we mark Tisha B'Av? And they say, no, it's going to be a happy days. It's also based on Zechariah the prophet statement here. So the day is marked in the calendar, but what is the nature, what is the character of the day? That changes from one generation to the next and from one segment of Judaism to the next. If you think about classical Reform Judaism, David Einhorn created a beautiful, completely inappropriate in my eyes, but beautiful celebration for Tisha B'Av as a celebration. On Tisha B'Av, on the 9th of Av, when our cultic center was destroyed, and I personally don't yearn for it to be rebuilt, but we became a prophetic nation, and we have a task, we have a goal, we have a role in the nations. So we have to celebrate it. So you see, this is a very, you can use it as a day of, that is a reciprocal, that is a container for all our sorrows and all our destructions. Some people suggested to mark the holiday on Tisha B'Av, but different generations and different movements treat it differently.
I love what you said about how even holidays that seem a little more, to use my language, like on brand, they shift a lot. I'm thinking about the image, if we're in like a theater, of like each holiday is sort of a light, like a spotlight. But then if you're doing the lighting, you can put different filters, you can put different color filters over them, and you can shift and so you could put like the blue one on, but you could, and so you could take the blue one out if blue is whatever the first meaning is, and then you could put a red one in if Tisha B'Av goes from, sad to celebration. I chose blue because blue is associated with sad, and I guess red is my best guess at happy. But like you could also layer the red one on top of the blue one, and it's purple. And you're combining the themes. I don't know. I'll have to play with that more.
I agree with you, and that's what makes it so rich, because you combine different ideas together. It's not one size fits all. It's not just one idea per one celebration or one festival. It has a variety of topics and interests. That's what makes it so difficult sometimes to deal with, but that's what also makes it so profound and compelling.
Yeah. I mean, the closing question I have, though, it's not about layering on the new filters to the spotlights. It really is about that impulse that Dan was critiquing to some degree, and that we've been talking about, of the adding on of new holidays, which I guess in this allegory would be like, I don't know, some additional beam of light in the theater. I don't know. Like, we'd have to think about that. But I want to flash to one of my favorite moments in your book, which is that you, in the month of Cheshvan, which people talk about Cheshvan, it's the 8th month in the biblical calendar. It's the 2nd month in the rabbinic calendar. They talk about it as a month that has no holidays. It does have Sigd, which is why I always like to bring it up, because it's my birthday, and I think Sigd is a meaningful festival. But if we take for a second that it is taken on a character of being a moment in the year without a ton of holidays, what's interesting is you talk about, in the Bible itself, this fella Jeroboam, who the phrasing is like he contrived a holiday of his own mind. The way the text talks about it is that he made up this holiday, and the text doesn't seem to like it very much.
Oh, no.
And the fact that he made up a holiday, it's like, you're this terrible guy in the northern kingdom. He's not seen as particularly good by a lot of the Bible. I mean, we've talked about this in the past. Dan has a love for the northern kingdom. Our friend of the podcast, Yochi Brandis, has done a lot with this in her books.
Right.
But like, how would you go about navigating those who would point at the idea of new holidays, of new Jewish creations anchored to the calendar, and say, that's nonsense? Are you on board with the way the Bible talks about Jeroboam, you contrived this holiday of your own mind? Or would you maybe celebrate that impulse a little bit? That's my closing question.
I don't think the Bible thinks that it's nonsense. I think they think it's evil, right? Because the Bible, as we know, at least these books of kings are influenced by the southern kingdom and the Judean kingdom and all that. But what Jeroboam did was he wanted to make a statement. We are no longer part of the Jerusalem situation. We don't need Jerusalem. We don't need the temple. We have something else. We're going to worship somewhere else. Different people are going to be the priests for us. We're going to do something else, and we're going to have a different time. Interestingly enough, and I think Yochi Brandes also speaks about it in her books, it's probably not a new festival. If the festival of Sukkot is about gathering the fruits, then in the northern part of Israel, where it's a bit colder, it takes longer. So you probably would have this celebration, pre-Israelite agricultural celebration, a month later. And when do you have it? When the moon is full, on the 15th day of the month. So what Jeroboam did here was probably not innovating something out of nothing. He was probably restoring an ancient celebration. So I think it's very cool because I always like the underdog. I will always be with the underdog. So I really I cheer for Jeroboam and his revolution that was free from bloodshed. It's just not a small thing, you know.
Thank you so much, Dalia Marx, for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Thank you. Toda rabba. These are very interesting and challenging questions. I have to think about all of them and to rethink about them because these are enduring questions. Thank you.
And thanks so much to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. As a reminder, we have some amazing 3-week mini courses that we're offering in the Onion Yeshiva. You can check them out at judaismunbound.com/classes. There's financial aid available to anyone who needs it. And there's some really, really amazing teachers, Miriam Grossman, C.B. Souther, and Chava Shapiro, who are teaching these 3 courses. And also, we want to remind you, as always, be in touch with us. It means the world when you send us notes. Let us know what your thoughts are about our recent podcast episodes, about our work more generally, whatever you're called to send us. So you can email us at dan@judaismunbound.com or lex@judaismunbound.com. You can also message us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. All of those are at Judaism Unbound for our handles. And you can head to our website to check out show notes for this episode, our other resources, all sorts of goodies at judaismunbound.com. We're also greatly appreciative if you are able to support us with a financial gift on either a monthly recurring basis or just as a one-time donation, which you can do via judaismunbound.com/donate. And before we go, support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Ashman Family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Ashman Family JCC empowers you to experience Jewish paths toward a life of joy, purpose, and meaning through innovative Jewish learning and wellness programs, community building, and initiatives to develop the next generation of Jewish leaders. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.